All right, we're recording. This is June 7, 2021, and we've got lots to get through. Thanks to everyone who took some time and really led the discussions for the past few meetings. I think we've had good progress and discussion around route binding, cross namespace forwarding, and route delegation, and of course, most recently, the idea of an optional gateway class. I don't want those to get lost. And so I want to spend a little bit of time following up on each of those and trying to understand what we need to do next for them. And then really what has been, I think, most obvious to me is as we've spent these meetings really focusing on new topics, we've developed quite a backlog of issues and PRs that have gotten neglected and haven't had any meeting time to really discuss them properly. This is in no particular order, but I did want to make sure we had some time to run through some or many of them. If you have one on this list or don't have one on this list and you want to move it higher to the top, by all means. This was really just a random assortment. So as always, if you would rather something get covered earlier, just move it up the agenda. Yeah, so first off, I am looking for somebody to volunteer to lead the June 21 meeting. That's 2 weeks from today. I'm going to be out of office. So if anyone is interested in leading one of these meetings, there's not a whole lot to it, but just leading discussion, getting an agenda together if there's not already one there. No pressure. I can ask again next week, but since the 2 weeks from now matches up with this specific time slot, I figured I'd ask here first. So I'll throw that out there. Is anyone interested in taking a shot at this 2 weeks from today?
I can do it, Rob. It's Nick.
Awesome. Thanks, Nick. Cool. I will put you down. Actually, let's just add it. Not sure what our topic will be yet, but we'll get there. So cool. Great. Thank you. So I wanted to run just a little bit through previous topics and next steps. So first off, we've got route binding. I think a lot of our things were related in some way to route binding. I think these first 3 topics, although they're not completely related to route binding, they all have an impact on it. And potentially even the gateway class discussion. If gateway class is optional, maybe that has an impact. I don't know, but all of these things felt like they were all leading together to something like where we needed to take a step back and try to understand the impact each of them would have. Like if we really wanted all of these concepts to come together, what it feels like they all affect each other. And so trying to solve one problem without keeping in mind all the other issues or goals we have here felt short-sighted. So I think maybe a good way to summarize what we've discussed so far is route should have an easier way to specify the gateways they want to bind to. So there's been some feedback and some suggestions that as a route owner, you want to choose to bind to a specific gateway, and that is relatively complex right now. Right now, our model is very much gateway to route. And so potentially providing an easier path to flip that on its head could be useful, where the route selects or chooses the gateway or gateways it wants to connect to. Similarly, route should be able to forward backends and other namespaces. That's one that is also, I think, a common feature request here, and very related to route should be able to include routes from other namespaces, because if we're crossing this namespace boundary at this level, we need to be very aware of all the different ways it's possible and ensure we include appropriate safeguards at each of these levels. So from my perspective, all of these concepts are closely related. And finally, the last thing that all feels like it fits into this is for both mesh and route delegation use cases, it could be useful to have a more generic from. So on routes, right now we have routes.gateways, and that refers to the level up in this DAG or whatever you want to call it, right? In this graph, and that works. But as we're talking about, well, a route may actually be included by a route, so that the thing above the route is another route. Or in mesh, what you're talking about is the route may be referencing a workload it wants to apply to, but the thing above is not always necessarily gateway. And maybe there's room to make that a little bit more generic. Yeah, so these are my thoughts here. I'm interested in if anyone else has been trying, thinking through this, trying to make sense of how all these different ideas jumble together. I started just some scratch thoughts on the gateway route binding doc at the bottom, but I don't have anything concrete to share at this point. It's just, this is something that I feel like they're all related. And in my mind, the next step is to try and come up with something that's a little bit more, a little bit broader in thought than just any individual topic here. I don't know, anyone have thoughts on this? I know it's
Hey,
pretty
Rob.
broad. Yeah.
I have a thought. So one thing I was sort of thinking about was trying to solve this with yet more CIDs. So we have this problem, like we're trying to wedge, security model. We're trying to have our idea of a security model, and I think the things we're trying to solve doesn't fit well with, the base Kubernetes security model. So we have gateways. We want to make sure that gateways don't pull anything they're not supposed to. We want to make sure that resources, people who own resources, can control what other resources pull the things they own. And so currently we're kind of putting all this policy into the core APIs, but maybe that's really a niche user case. Maybe people that need to think about this are serious production users, which who are going to think through these, who are going to think through this, and maybe we don't need to kind of push this complexity onto every user. So it occurs to me that if we had a specific route binding CRD, that could be a place where you could put it in the namespace next to the resource that you care about, and you'd be able to express the policy that you wanted. So you have a gateway and you have a route binding policy resource next to your gateway, and that route binding policy resource would say, okay, this gateway is only allowed to bind routes from these particular locations. Then when you own a route, if you don't want your route to be used by a bunch of random stuff, you put a route binding policy next to your route. You say, well, this route can only be used by, these other routes or these other gateways or whatever your policy is. So the complexity of controlling how you're binding is kind of put to one side into a separate CID, so it's not in your face the whole time. And you kind of have a lot more, and you can kind of have one CID which kind of expresses your security policy and is independent of all the HTTP and routing and application level things which you're dealing with in the primary CIDs. Now the cost, of course, is okay. It's an extra CID, and I know people have always concerned about adding extra CIDs, but maybe in this case, the cost of that is outweighed by the benefit of moving that complexity onto a side path.
Yeah, that's sorry, I got my unmute shortcut confused with mute. So yes, anyways, I really like that idea. I want to sketch it out, or if you had more concrete thoughts, if you want to sketch it out. I am very aware that any of the route delegation or route binding models we're discussing add significant complexity, and that complexity is something that we're talking about maybe 5% of users really taking advantage of. Maybe less. Who am I to say the percentage of users that will use a feature? Maybe that's something we can sidebar to. I think it's functionality we need to have, but if it's something that we say, okay, for these more complex use cases, and I'm specifically thinking about the cross namespace binding. I don't know if that's where you were going with that, but I think when we start to cross those namespace boundaries, that's where we really get into concerns for RBAC, for auth in general.
Yeah, I agree.
And so maybe that's the place where we differentiate and say, hey, if you want to cross a namespace boundary, you need this extra something. I don't know. This is very much still brainstorming.
I think I'd be okay with saying, like, okay, the default is your default is that references work, you know, based on your controller, whatever your controller's RBAC is. So if your controller has RBAC for everything, it'll work. But then if you want to, once you kind of start locking things down, then you add policy. I think the thing I have in mind is actually a little like the Contour TLS delegation CRD.
Yeah, but that's the opposite of the TLS delegation. In that,
well, yeah, it's the opposite default policy. Yeah.
Yeah. So, for those of you who haven't heard of it, I was about to say the same thing. Contour has another object called TLS certificate delegation. What that does is, if you refer to a TLS certificate using a namespace, and the hack we did in the early days was that for ingress, you could just refer to where you have the secret name, you could just put namespace / secret name. And if you did that, and then Contour would be like, oh, that's a reference in another namespace. And then it would go off to the other namespace and look for it. And in the other namespace, there also needed to be an object called a TLS certificate delegation that was a separately controlled object that basically just had a thing saying the TLS certificate named, the TLS certificate stored in the secret named whatever, may be used by namespaces matching this spec. And so that's kind of the opposite way, that by default, you can't do cross namespace things, and you can opt in by creating this thing. From what I have seen about like other folks from API machinery and other things, I feel like a lot of the security related people and the API machinery related people are very reluctant to have things that allow you to cross namespace boundaries by default. I think that almost certainly everyone will be much more comfortable if there is a method of crossing namespace boundaries, you have to opt into it, and that it's something like that. If you wanted to have a separate thing to do that, then that would kind of make sense. Then because then the person who owns the receiving namespace has to create that object, and that means that you can RBAC those objects to make sure that only people who should be allowed to create the reference can create the reference as well, because it's a separate object. And that's as James said, the disadvantage of having an extra CRD is there's an extra CRD. The advantage of having the extra CRD is that it gives you separate RBAC for those objects.
Yeah, I'd be fine with flipping the default policy, and I think to some degree that's a quality of implementation issue. So by default, you might say that you fail closed, but maybe you have on your ingress controller you have like a debug or a development flag where people who are running a local kind cluster and don't want to deal with something can turn that on and say, well, I want to fail open. But I think probably makes sense to have fail closed as a default, and in the spec as a strong recommendation or a must.
So yeah, I think that sort of the separate binding resource thing, is for cross namespace references, covers the, referring to backends in other namespaces, the referring to routes in other namespaces, referring to gateways in other namespaces, that sort of thing. But it doesn't solve the problem of how do we do the, how do we specify bindings? How do we specify this bidirectional binding?
What do you mean it doesn't solve that problem?
Well, as in it doesn't solve the problem of how you specify it. Like you still need the options to be, don't you still need the options to be able to say, well, you want to select all things by selector, and you want to select, things that are in a list of namespaces or something like that. Like you still want to be able to do that, right? Like you don't want to just be like,
Oh yeah, you want to be able to specify the bindings, but you don't need to be able to, you don't need to have the bidirectional handshake anymore, right? So you can have a route which says I want to be on these gateways, which is one way of binding things. And you can also have a gateway which says I want these routes, which is a separate way of binding things. And those two things can be orthogonal. You don't have to have them match anymore.
I think so. I think I agree with that, but I think the fundamental issue you'd end up with here is that if this new resource, if we go this path of a binding resource, if this resource exists in a namespace, how do you trust, like namespace A wants to forward traffic to namespace B. And so you create this binding resource in namespace A. How does namespace B have any control over that?
So,
right? Do you need?
So you can have bindings in both namespaces, right?
We're not reducing the complexity then, because all we're doing is adding another layer of dual directional binding, right? Like you're still going to have dual directional binding because you've got the cross product of being able to refer from the gateway to the route and from the route to the gateway. And now you've also got the additional cross product of being able to have a policy from the referred namespace or the referring namespace.
Okay, but no, these are now all independent controls, right? So you can think about them all. You can think about them all one at a time.
But you've still got to think about the cross product of what happens when you use all of them, right? Like, because some people are going to say, well, what happens when I do, referring from namespace A to namespace B, like gateway A in namespace A refers to all routes in namespace B. Only some routes in namespace B say that they should be accepted by gateway A in namespace A, and that's controlled by a binding object in namespace B, right? Like, that's a huge cross product of complexity we've added by adding this extra layer of things, right?
Okay, so I don't think it's added, because this is exactly the case that we're talking about. The question is where you put the complexity. Do you put that directly in the core API CRDs and express it in every place where things can be bound or things can be referenced, or do you put it to the side so that it can be one mechanism can be used in multiple contexts? I think that's the way I see the question.
Yeah, and I think there's a path. I don't want to get stuck too long on this, but I think there's a path where a binding resource is like what we're describing here is something that allows resources to describe where they can be referenced from. So we're only talking about one side of that, and then you still allow that selection mechanism from gateway to select whatever. And if it can't, if the binding resource doesn't exist in a namespace it's trying to select, we have the same issue, but at least we have created a generic way of doing that instead of having to recreate the same model for cross namespace references, cross namespace forwarding, cross namespace inclusion, all these different things. They're very similar, and I think there's some value there in a generic resource that can communicate that. This is a really good idea. I saw a couple other people unmute momentarily. Were there other thoughts on this that we missed?
There's a couple of points I wanted to make, and one was that the use case with the permissions and such could be, in some cases that the owner of the gateway is only going to approve certain specific routes, and it could be in the other case where it's the the owners of the applications, if you will, that are going to choose which gateways they bind to. So you kind of have to support both models, and I've seen both. I've also seen where the distinction is between namespaces. Example, the gateway lives in one namespace and the routes point to services in another namespace, but I've seen it also where they're in the same namespace. So we have to do it in a way that doesn't force a specific type of namespace organization. That's kind of the opposite way we should be doing it. So those are just my couple of comments.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. That's a good point. We're seeing lots of different use cases here, and we're trying to find an approach that can be as generic as possible to support, well, really all of those use cases you described there, while also still being simple enough to work for the simplest same namespace use case. We don't want to overly complicate the same namespace use case that, say, 90% of users, maybe it's not going to be 90% of users, but a chunk of users end up using. But at the same time, we want to enable all those advanced use cases. Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like
Okay.
It feels to me like the default position should just be same namespace needs none of this extra shenanigans, and
Yes.
everything will work. If you just refer by name, then everything will just work with same namespace, and that's where you want to be.
Yeah. Cool. I think okay, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if this is supported or not, but is gateway merging across namespace, that is something that we support? I mean, what if you could have, like, that does not solve all use cases, because you could have a route that points to services in 2 different namespaces. But if you have a gateway in namespace A and a gateway in namespace B, they are supported by the same underlying implementation. So imagine a single IP that's doing all the work. Now you have a different way of solving cross namespace routing at a higher granularity, though, right? Like, you cannot have a route that points to different names. Like, that within that route, you cannot point to different namespaces. But then you can have configuration from multiple namespaces bind to a single implementation.
It's a little bit like what we have now in Contour, where for the HTTP proxy thing, you can specify a list of namespaces that can have the root HTTP proxy, which is broadly equivalent to gateway for some things. I think that my reading, I can't remember their exact discussions about it, but my reading was always, hey, if you want to merge the gateways, that's kind of up to you. It's an implementation specific thing. If you do, here's a couple of rules you should do, but merging of gateways and merging of listeners is like kind of like, world chief, that's an implementation thing. I don't think there's any rules. The number of rules we put around that was very minimal, I seem to remember.
That's fair. Yeah, I think that's correct.
Yeah, I think my thoughts is I don't think we've said anything in the spec to prevent that from happening, but I would rather provide a consistent approach that works across all implementations to accomplish that. And I think it's possible.
It's a bit like the as if rule, right? Like, I mean, if it works as if, then who cares what you do under the hood?
Yeah. So I mean, in my mind, the way that you handle merging gateways, no matter where they are, is that you create one big gateway with a whole bunch of listeners and a whole bunch of addresses, and as long as there's no conflicts in that one big resource, then everything's fine. So conflict resolution behavior is important, but aside from that, it doesn't matter.
Yeah. All right, well, let me keep on going. This has been good discussion, and I think this provides a really good follow-up here of, I think James, it may have been your idea to start with, but yeah, really good idea to move forward with this. On the other proposals here, are there other follow-ups that we should be working on? I feel like this key idea of policy of getting binding right is a key one, but are there other areas we've kind of gotten stuck? Anyone need some help on a specific proposal?
Before we move on, one of the things I just wanted to say was I feel like this feels like this binding object we were talking about feels like a generic sort of reference policy object. And that's important because it actually came up in some of the stuff that the PRs that you and I were working on recently, Rob, with the namespace, the host name selection. And it's for some things, like if we're going to talk about it like this, it's actually not really binding, because if you fail a binding, that's an error. If you fail a selection, that's not an error. Right. So this is like a thing that influences what references just are valid references. Right. So it means that from a route, you can refer to another route or to a service or something. And if there's this binding object there, that just means that it can put the route in or out of the list of valid things that are selected. Right. And if it fails selection because of that, that's not an error. That's by design. Right. Like, and that was a little flip that I needed to make in my head. That binding is actually the wrong word to be using here, because binding implies that it should succeed, whereas selection does not imply that it should succeed. And so like this is like a reference policy or a selection policy or something like that we're talking about. And that's relevant because you're talking about policy attachment in the next section.
Yeah, that's good call. Yeah, that very relevant. Thank you for tying those two together. I'll skip over gateway class. I don't see Damian here, but he had a good presentation in doc last week about if there were ways we could avoid or at least make gateway class optional. That was a good discussion. I need to circle back and actually look at the doc again, but for anyone curious, it's linked up here and it's linked in the previous agenda as well. What I've been spending a lot of time thinking about policy attachment and how this could work. And with GKE and GCP, we have lots of different potential kinds of policy we might want to attach. And some of that is represented in our existing backend config resource. But we also have lots more that we've been trying to make sense of and find ways that we could attach this to the API. But we're just a small piece of this puzzle. And as I'm thinking about this, I was curious if other implementations here have been thinking about kinds of policy they may want to attach in the API right now that are not currently supported and likely don't have a path to a core part in the API itself. So they're not portable enough that they could be within the API. I would like to get some kind of scoping to understand the kinds of policy that I'm familiar with, the policy we're interested in attaching, but I'm interested in what else is out there. So if anyone else has examples, if you can add them to this list, if you can, whatever, if you can ping me or in the main Slack as well, whatever works. I'm just trying to get a broader picture of what's out there and what we're working towards, so that we can find some kind of generic policy attachment mechanism that works well. Because I'm finding that depending on the policy, you may want to attach it different ways and at different places. And you can have a pretty generic model, but it helps to have real examples. Like there's somewhat generic concepts of retry or health check or these kinds of concepts. But I know there's other more vendor specific policies out there. And I want to make sure that we can provide at least a pattern that works for everyone. So even though the specific policy may be implementation specific, we're attaching it in the same way. So there's consistency among implementations. Yeah, I don't know. Anyone have thought much about this already, or is this a little bit too far out?
No, I added an issue of service level config a while ago, and we did have a long discussion around it. So I think all of those we have already discussed them,
Yeah.
but those are all some things that I think we need in the policy.
Yeah.
Yeah, there are definitely some implementation specific things that I would be interested in. I'll go back and add them in here.
Okay. Yeah, this all looks very familiar. Thanks.
Yeah, I think for Contour, we had the same thing with HTTP proxy. We have a number of policy kind of things that are that are the same sort of thing. You're setting some config, but sometimes you want the config to flow from a higher level thing down to a lower level thing, and so it's a policy. In my mind, that's the thing that makes it a policy, is that you want to be able to define the default policy at a higher level and have more specific, Beatly specific. So examples of that are load balancer, timeout, retry, health check, all the stuff that Harry has talked about. I think we talked before about how the timeout one is like one of the hardest ones to get right because everybody does that differently. And so I think timeout, interestingly enough, is actually probably a really good use case to check, because A, you want to be able to specify it at a very general level and override it on probably multiple levels. B, you want to be able to put bounds around the overriding, because sometimes people don't want infinite, sometimes administrators don't want app developers to be able to allow infinite client request timeout, for example. But also then you've got different timeouts that may be implemented by different data paths, and some people's data path may cover this much of a timeout, and then other people's may cover this much, right? Like, or I may even have the same name, right? Like and so I think timeout policy is actually one of the best ones to use as like a test case, because it's like the worst. Like it's got like the least amount of commonality in the specific details, but the most amount of commonality in the things that everybody wants, right? Like everybody wants to be able to do a client request timeout of some sort. Everybody wants to be able to do like a back-end timeout for proxies and stuff like that. But the exact details are almost certainly going to be different. So you're talking about the same thing in the broad strokes, but it's not the same thing in the ways that matter. So I think it's one of the best options that you can do. It's the same for health checking and and load balancer policy, like round robins, weighted list, that sort of, how do you bucket your connections, all that sort of stuff.
I agree that that's a good test case, and I think the requirements for policy are, at least the way I've been thinking about it, is it needs to be able to attach arbitrary and proprietary policy at many different levels, right? Because everyone will have something different, and we can't anticipate at what level it gets attached. And the level attachment actually plays two roles. One is it allows an implementer to attach policy at basically any resource, any part of the resource tree. But two, it does, once, if you add that an override ability or something like that, then you now have a trickle down policy type effect. So it really kind of plays two roles, which are pretty complementary.
And the reason I said earlier that the thing that we were talking about earlier was relevant is that if we want to be able to have this sort of you can attach any old thing policy, then basically, because these are Kubernetes API objects, you're talking about needing to have a object reference of some sort, which is going to include like a GVK or GVR name and a namespace. And that means that the problem there is that everybody's going to end up with their own policy objects, right? But if you have a mechanism for saying like, not only do you need to do GVK or GVR, but the person who owns the policy can set some like policy about like how that policy should be used. But the thing is, that is then a selector policy, right? Because where you're referring to the policy, again, this is the exact sort of thing where if you just have a name and namespace, like you're probably going to be too limiting, because people may want to say like, I want to have 10 different policies of the same kind that the controller will munch, right? So it needs to have the same mechanism as we have for choosing routes or gateways or anything like that. It needs to have this, basically this again is the same sort of referred, like the same sort of reference that we're talking about for gateways, for routes, for that bidirectional mapping, it's the same mechanism again. You need to be able to have you need to be able to have same namespace, selector, name and namespace, list of objects, all of those things that you're going to need no matter what you're referring to. And so it feels to me like if we can solve that generic problem of having, this is how the Gateway API does references and to other objects, and then that means that you can just use that for the policy objects. You can use that for route objects. You can use that for gateway objects. And then, if you once you have this sort of falls out of selection behavior, then it means that it'll just make that a lot easier, I think, because then you don't need to have policy. Like you don't need to have a meta policy object that describes how your policy can be used because you're just excluding it from being selected.
Yeah, I agree with that. I would say a lot of what we're talking about for policy here is not so much what the policy includes, but like you're saying, how it's connected. And that's so much of what we're struggling with in this API is how we connect all these different resources in a way that makes sense, in a way that users can understand, and in a way that accomplishes all these various use cases. But especially for policy, when we're talking about, N CRDs, we want a consistent way to do that. And let me transition to that. So far, I've been assuming that the best way to attach policy is with CRs. So a vendor would provide their own CRD or CRDs that describe policy that they support, and that could be attached in a consistent way to different levels of this API. Alternatives that I think we've considered would be annotations or generic map string inside structs inside our CRs themselves, but none of those seem great. And until inline CRDs become a thing, it seems like our best option is really just this per vendor policy CRD. Does that match with what others are thinking here, or yeah?
For me, it does. I would say that as part of this API, we should declare like a general shape that the CRDs need to be able to fit through. I'm thinking about basically a duck typing requirement or an interface requirement. Like your policy CRD must, the policy CRDs that you refer to must have a status that has a conditions, and it must have a field that lets you do this, and it must have a field that lets you do this. Like it basically just outlines the general shape, and then you can say, okay, but then now you can have specific stuff under this bit, and that's all up to you. But it means that you can duck type you can pull a config off as unstructured, and then duck type it into something and get an idea about what it's about. And then that sort of the important part there is that you can, if you require like a specific status field or something like that, you can use that to say, is this relevant to me? Like, can I implement this? Or something like that. So I mean, you can do that with the kind, obviously, but that means you can make that a little bit more generic. Like if you have something that's like policy describes configuration for Envoy, then anything that uses Envoy as its data plane would be able to pick up that policy and use it, even if it's not your policy, right? Like you can anticipate that it'll probably be something that will work for you, and you should be able to figure it out, or something like that. Like basically, I'm just thinking of like a Go interface definition, right? Like, or something like a little bit like that. Also mandates some fields or something.
That lines up exactly with what I'd been thinking about, which was enough consistency and enough of a guideline here where we could make a kubectl plugin that could understand policy from any vendor and represent it in a generic way. So if this is not the best example, but if anyone is familiar with debugging CSS back in the day and running through, and you see, okay, this specific class applies here, but actually there's a more specific style definition And so this little thing is crossed out at very, very helpful. And if we can make our policy generic and well, consistent enough and provide a well-spec'd way to do this, then I think you can use the same UX to understand policy that has been applied. And some of those policies may be core, like maybe health check is that example of a policy that is really a core concept that is broadly supportable. And maybe something like timeout that we've already established is unique enough that does not, is something that is always going to be vendor specific, but at least that way you can have the same experience with all policy that's attached and see, okay, this policy plus this policy are attached. These are just goals now, but I wanted to have this conversation to better guide my thoughts here. I'm hoping, I haven't put this together yet, but I'm hoping one of the next two meetings we can cover policy, and the other one I think is really just going back through and talking about connection. Maybe it's this route gateway binding plus that cross namespace discussion we're having. But these are the topics that are top of mind for me. So yeah. And with that, I know I mentioned at the beginning that we are struggling to find enough time in these meetings to get to PR and issue triage, and I do want to make that happen. So just do a quick run through. A lot of these I think are going to be quick and easy to get through. It looks like there's no one hates this. So any hesitation to make our default for PRs to squash by default? If not, I'll just pull this one in. Oh, I'm not signed in. How embarrassing. All right. Let me, I will, or unless someone else wants to add a final LGTM on this or approve on this one, I think we're fine with that. Summary of out of tree problems. This had a lot of discussion. It was mostly 2 weeks ago, but that lined up with a meeting day where we didn't really have much time to discuss this. We still don't have a lot of time to discuss this, but this is really just trying to make sense of where we line up and how we manage CRDs across different environments. The consensus we got talking with API Machinery, Daniel Smith, and some others was that this is really the future of Kubernetes, that we should be, CRDs are not perfect, but they are the future. And this is what we should be doing. I know we talked about, well, maybe we could go in tree, maybe we could do these other things, but at this point in time, the guidance is we should make the most of CRDs and help make the path easier for future implementations, future APIs. Like network policy folks are following the same model, right? And so there will be many others, and so we just need to make this as easy as possible, well, as easy to use as possible, and provide lots of feedback to API Machinery so they can make the experience better going forward. There were some interesting bits of feedback, but I don't want to spend too much time on this discussion other than to highlight that there's been a fair amount if you haven't looked in the past couple weeks. All right, let me keep on. Oh, go ahead.
I have a question. So in terms of providing feedback, should we be like opening issues, or like, I know you have created a doc discussing this, like what is the best way to make sure that people know of the problems that we are running into, and most probably others who follow the same path will run into?
That's a really good question. Yeah, so we added them here, but that's probably not sufficient. Let one of us, it can be you, or if you don't, I'll follow up on this thread. But I think if you ping Daniel or Antoine, I think they're the most involved in this thread. I think they might have some better guidance on if there's like a repo we can file these issues on that is more visible to them, because they only pay attention to our issues if we at them every time, you know. So, and that's, you know, I know their GitHub notifications are crazy. So yeah, that's a good follow-up.
Okay, I'll follow up with them.
Great.
Just want to make sure these issues are sort of large, and I'm pretty sure
Yeah.
it will take significant amount of time to resolve them, right? Like, so they probably
Yes.
need to break it down into multiple things. So, okay,
Yeah,
I'll follow up.
for sure. Cool, thanks.
I'd also be hopeful that if we do figure out something with that selector/binding thing, that whatever we learn they would probably be pretty interested in. Whatever we come up with, they'd probably be pretty interested in knowing about.
Yes. Yeah. Related to API machinery, it has come out that we really should be moving to K8s.io. Already had some decent conversation on here, but K8s.io as an API group is intended to represent official Kubernetes APIs that are headed towards some form of stability. I think, and I kind of threw this in here, this is my perspective on what we're hoping to accomplish with V1 Alpha 2. I hope this matches with everyone else's, but from my perspective, V1 Alpha 2 will include breaking changes, but from that point on, at the very least, we want future API versions to be fully convertible. So you can go back and forth, so they can all be served at the same time. And ideally, though not guaranteed, no breaking changes past V1 Alpha 2, because we can only stay in alpha so long. We do want to get to some form of stability. We do want to, I'm sure we all want to have products based on a non-alpha API. So at some point we want to get to beta, and the way to get to beta is to stop breaking things. So with that, those are my goals for this. And so it feels like a good and fitting time to move from the experimental set of APIs to this is an official API that's going through all the full API review process, etc. Yeah, so that makes sense to me. With that said, there's an earlier Slack thread that anyone's welcome to read through. This included Tim, Jordan, Antonio, and I think a few other people in SIG Network. And we talked about it a bit then, and then I followed up with Tim and Jordan more recently, and it does sound like this is the direction we should be going. I threw out a few different names here. If you feel strongly about the API group we try to move to, just add a comment here. We're also trying to coordinate with the network policy working group because they're really trying to do the same thing we are. Yeah, that's all there is to that, but just a heads up that this is something that I think we should change as part of V1 Alpha 2. Cool, let me keep on running. Yeah, we just have all kinds of API machinery things today. I don't, Mike, you are on this call. You have been proven right all these months later. Congratulations. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you are the one who suggested that we use resource as a reference instead of kind.
Yeah, going off of advice from David Eads, and I see he's CC'd in the same queue.
Yeah, and it does seem like a PR a very related PR. I think he was involved in the no, maybe he wasn't involved in the review. Yeah, he was. So anyways, this is now officially, as of 12 days ago, or maybe whenever it merged, 12 days ago, officially guidance now that object references should use resources instead of kind. So that's checked in and it's official, and it seems like we should probably do that. So unless there's hesitation from anyone, I think this is just a thing we should do. I can't argue too much with the API conventions. Any hesitation on this one? Cool. Just a heads up, this is probably a pretty easy one to knock out if anyone wants to get a contribution in. All right. Okay, this is a really quick one. It's hardly worth a mention. Conformance tests have the least exciting thing in the world, but they are making progress, which is exciting. I have started a separate PR. I have a refresh PR that's 5.16 that works and uses Gateway API, and this just uses standard Go tests, and it's fine. But I also wanted to explore something that was more similar to ingress controller conformance, which meant using GoDog. This is still pretty rough, very rough. Yeah, so just seeing this feedback for the first time. This is really meant to be more of a PR to say, hey, this is a thing that is being worked on, but there's still just a lot to do here. But if you want to look at it high level, and I would say it's promising is what I would say. But if you have strong feelings, what I'm trying to do here in this PR is show both how standard Go tests look alongside GoDog. So I'm trying to reuse as much code as possible and then show basically the two options. I've been hesitant to use GoDog because I think it adds this extra layer of complexity and potential, translation and debuggability concerns. But I wanted to give it a fair shake, and the way I'm doing that or trying to do that is just show them side by side and try and move forward with whatever makes sense. But this is still very rough, but just a heads up, this is something like I'm working on.
Could you just quickly run through when you say the conformance test, how do these conformance tests work? I mean, obviously you're writing them with GoDog, but how do they actually test the conformance?
Yeah, so the general pattern in all of these is similar to ingress controller conformance in the sense that they apply some manifests and then they expect a certain behavior to happen. So right now, the one thing these test in either case is really the simplest thing to test. It's that within a certain period of time, a condition is set in status. That's, but ideally, and what ingress controller conformance already does is it makes actual HTTP requests based on the status of, ingress status, sends a request to that IP, etc. So that's the end goal here. But for right now, it's just testing conformance. The way that I ended up implementing this is gateway class YAML. These tests assume that you have a gateway class called, I think, gateway conformance in your cluster, and that can point to whatever controller you want, whatever params you want, and all the tests will just run with that specific class. So that allows you to provision whatever controller implementation you want and run these. With that said, there's a ton of work. This is not meant to be a final. It's just meant to start discussion around what kinds of things we want to do here and what we want to achieve. And if there's an entirely different approach that someone has liked for conformance, I'm not tied to either of these. So if you have opinions, this is a great time to get them in.
Yeah, thanks. I asked because we're working on a conformance suite for Contour as well, so tech is going to be a lot. So I'll point the guys who are working on that at this so that they can see if there's any cross-pollination we can do there.
No, I'm interested in anything. Do you know what technology you're using?
Right now, I think we're using a similar sort of thing, but we're just using our home roll thing.
Okay.
We're not using Dog or whatever the other one is. I can't remember.
Okay.
One of the other frameworks. So I think, but basically I think the guys have ended up writing our own framework. So I'm kind of more inclined to be like, well, if we're going to use a framework, let's use one that someone else wrote so that we don't have to do all the work of doing it. But so I've been, they've been doing their thing for a bit, and I've only been keeping a light eye on it, but I'll definitely ping them with this and see if there's some cross-pollination we can do. Cool. I would guess the reason I think it's a really good idea to have something in here that's reasonably standard is that then it's a good way for controller implementers to have something that they can base their own set of tests off. Like if you can take these tests and then like add another set of tests that's test your implementation specific things, that's much easier than needing to figure out how to build a list right from scratch. It's hard.
For sure. And these are very similar in scope and architecture to Ingress controller conformance, except these are much less polished. But we'll get there maybe. Cool. Let me, we really don't have much time left. There's a few of these that are just, they feel like some of these PRs may just be falling off or need just another ping. So let me follow up on these after the meeting. I'll just ping the PRs themselves. I
can see 3 or 4 of them in my to read through this, but bandwidth. Right?
I haven't been paying attention to mine, so I'll make sure I go ahead and check mine.
Perfect. Cool. And for next topics, we kind of already discussed this. I'll see how things go for me this week, but I feel like these are the next big topics in my mind. It's either going to be this kind of follow-up discussion about how all these route gateway connections work together, or policy attachment, and both of them are top of mind to me. I don't have a strong feeling as far as which should be our next meeting. If anyone has a preference, if anyone really wants to be part of that discussion or lead that discussion, let me know. And actually, Nick, if you're going to lead the June 21 one, let me know there if you have a preference, which topic you talk about. And
I think off the top of my head, I'm hoping that by then, I'd like to actually try and work on a doc about the selection policy thing and what we're trying to achieve with that and different approaches we could do. I think the James's idea about the sort of the control object is a good one, but that we sort of need to be like, we're solving a generic problem here. Let's set it out as a generic problem and say, and sort of I'll try and propose some sort of solution there. So I think that would be a good time to talk about that, because that gives a couple of weeks to back and forth on a doc or something.
Perfect.
And then that a chance to present that. I'm happy to put that there. I think whatever discussion we have about that will probably play into a lot of the other things we're going to do, because it's such a fundamental. I will try and get that started in the next couple of days, so that we can have some. So you guys can have something to talk about next week, because sorry, I'm not getting up at like 1 o'clock in the morning. So. I like you all.
I understand. Sounds good. All right. Well, thanks a bunch. Looking forward to it. And we'll talk to some of you next week. All right. See ya.